What's going on, everyone? So we've had a ton of higher rarity cards spoiled for Shadows of the Galaxy, which is really exciting. And I want to talk about a few of them today as they look like some of the most sweet cards that we've seen so far. In particular, there's a 1/3 drop that, well, looks like a potential new staple of every single deck going forward, basically, as long as you're in the aspect. Without further ado, let's dive into it. Starting us off with Kinton Intimidator. Now, this one is our common of the list. We've got a 1 resource. Actually, I don't know if there's more commons, but a 1 resource ground unit in Cunning Villainy 1/4 Underworld, which is extremely relevant, as I mentioned. In previous videos, we now finally have a reason as to why Underworld is important. But on attack, you get to exhaust the defender. So kind of cool, as in the portrait, you have a stun stick here. So the idea is you hit a unit, it exhausts it, it's a stun stick, and you stun basically all the units that you're hitting. It's interesting. The idea behind this is that you hit it a couple times and you're able to stall out damage. There's a few problems with this. One, you're going to need the initiative. And 2, it probably will just die off after about 2 attacks, right? Even if you talk about like 2 3s or even like a 3/3, it's just going to die in 2 attacks. However, there's a really big upside, which is it absolutely destroys 3/1s. It not only kills it, it also costs 1 resource, and you get to have 1/1 left behind that will potentially exhaust something else in the future. So I think this is actually a really interesting sideboard card against decks that are playing 3/1s. And it also could potentially see some play if you're looking for that type of effect. Maybe you upgrade it, maybe you synergize with some sort of exhausting strategy, and I could see some effects there. So interesting. I think it actually has good stats for a 1 resource unit, and I could see it potentially seeing play as a way to get rid of those 3/1s. It just doesn't really stat up against those higher value 2 resource plays. Next up, we have another rare here in Tarfful, a 7 resource ground unit in Just Heroism, a 3/9 with Restore 2. And when a friendly Wookiee unit is dealt combat damage and isn't defeated, that unit deals that much damage to an enemy ground unit. So what I really like about this is we're finally seeing a Wookiee payoff. So far, what we've seen with other Wookiees is that they have the same idea, the same strategy. They either have like high toughness with grit, or they're trying to do something with healing up and kind of outvaluing your opponents. This has direct synergies with other Wookiees, as it directly mentions Wookiees. Okay, here's what I really like about this card. It is a play that you can make the same turn Chewbacca comes down. Now, Chewbacca is absolutely absurd with this card, right? Because you're not going to be able to defeat Chewbacca. And I mean Chewbacca leader, by the way. If I pull up Chewbacca here as a leader here, we have, let me just pull up. Sorry, I got to pull up the tab here. We have Chewbacca leader. He's a 7 resource to deploy. He's going to come down as a 2/9. You're going to have to attack Chewbacca, and he's going to live, almost assuredly. And then you get to go ahead and smack something else on your opponent's side of the battlefield. That seems absolutely sweet to me, okay? So that is a really nice synergy. Here's the problem with this card. It is a 3/9, which isn't like amazing stats. When you're looking at a 7 resource play, you're looking at something like a 7/6, a 7/7. That type of stuff is really nice stats. A total of like 13, 14 points of stats. Here we have 12, and it's all focused on the toughness side of things. What it is nice is you're not going to be able to, or you're not going to want to trade into this guy or try to attack him, because you're probably not going to defeat him in 1 shot, which means he's going to be able to hit back one of your other ground units. But there's a lot of restrictions with this card. It needs to be able to be used with other Wookiees. Your Wookiees need to not die, and it needs to have another ground unit target for it to actually get any value whatsoever. The Restore 2 is nice, and I do think this can be interesting in future sets if we get more Wookiee support. The problem right now is that all the Wookiees seem to be like high toughness, trying to get extra value for your units, and there's not really that many support cards in the earlier stages of the game for this archetype to really push it. However, maybe this is just a value unit with all the other Wookiees that you're running, and maybe you can run it with a Chewbacca deck. So I do think this has some interesting mechanics. And again, the thing I'm really excited about is the fact that you could play Chewbacca on the same turn this comes down and have a 2/9 Sentinel Grit that's just going to absolutely massacre their board. The only problem is, by that point, are you going to be dead? And even if you aren't, you probably already have the ground arena locked down. And so you really need to worry about the space arena or even direct damage. And Tarfful does help with direct damage, but I just don't know how strong this card really is at 7. Next one up is Outlaw Corona, and it looks like another common here. 3 resource space unit command and a really nice stat line in 3/5 underworld vehicle capital ship. But here is the downside, and this is a major downside. Bounty, put the top card of your deck into play as a resource. Now here's the thing with this card. You are absolutely, as the opponent, going to want to focus this down because you get a resupply for free while killing their unit. That's crazy. Now, here's the crazy part about this even further, is that you could capture this to claim the bounty, and even if they, let's say, kill your unit that's captured the Outlaw Corona, guess what? You can just kill their Outlaw Corona again, or you don't even care because you've already ramped past that situation, right? Let's say you, I don't know, play some sort of space unit like a assistant patrol craft. You end up capturing the Outlaw Corona under the assistant patrol craft. Your opponent comes in, they try to trade with their assistant patrol craft. Maybe they trade it and get some value out of it, like they don't lose their unit or whatnot. But you've stalled a ton of damage. You're able to ramp, and now you're able to get to the later stages of the game. This really, I think, is a major downside and one of the biggest bounty downsides that we've seen. Things like drawing a card, doing some damage, healing your base, whatever it is. Sometimes, you know, in a lot of cases, your opponent's putting those bounties on your units, so there's nothing you can really do about that. I guess the only other bounty that I consider as detrimental as this one might be Dr. Evazan's, where you get to ready a bunch of resources. You can outvalue your opponent by doing something like Boba, where you get to do multiple spells in a turn, multiple events, multiple units, or whatever it is. But this is really, really bad for you. I don't know if the 3/5 stat line is good enough. We do see things like a 3/4, like Millennium Falcon with a downside. We've seen, you know, 3 resource, 3 power, 3 toughness space units. That's kind of like the going rate. So it does have 2 points of extra toughness on top of it. But the problem is it doesn't have extra power. And when you're looking at more of an aggressive deck that might want to leverage this extra stat line and try to get the value out of it, even though there's a huge downside for you, you want the extra power, I think, and the toughness doesn't matter as much. So I don't know if this is going to be a viable option. I do think it's going to be powerful and limited, though, which I'm pretty excited about. Next up, we have a new rare. I remember thinking this is a legendary because of the fact that people were like, no way is this a rare. It is a 7 resource ground unit in command villainy Maul, 7/6 force underworld, ambush, overwhelm. On attack, you may choose another friendly underworld unit. If you do, all combat damage that will be dealt to this unit during this attack is dealt to the chosen unit instead. So this one's a really powerful one. Obviously, we have the Force and Underworld synergies. Force synergies more specifically that can work with Maul. However, this just kind of looks like a Mace Windu. It comes down, it's able to hit your opponent's units, kill them, and then hit their base. It does kind of the same idea that Mace Windu does, in that Mace Windu comes down, kills a unit, readies, and attacks their base. However, this does it at all one attack, and what's important about it is that it has the 7 power. Now, if you look at some of the other units that are being played around this cost or just before it, Mace Windu oftentimes actually can't kill your opponent's units. Think about things like, let's say a Gorilla Attack Pod or a Zeb, or things like that coming down, or, you know, in more recent times like Darth Vader, things like that. Some of them Mace Windu can kill. It can kill Zebs, it can kill, you know, K2SOs, it can't kill Gorilla Attack Pods, it can't kill Darth Vaders. And that's one of the reasons why I think we see Mace Windu not being played as much as a lot of people ought to think about Mace Windu. Maul, on the other hand, it kills basically everything you're going to see. That's 7 power. It's going to kill Darth Vader. It's going to kill Gorilla Attack Pods. It's going to kill whatever it needs to kill. And it's going to hit your opponent's base if it overkills. And arguably, one of the most important parts about it is it's going to stick around as a 7/6 if you have any other Underworld unit on the battlefield. And if you look at like Boba Green, for example, I would absolutely love to play maybe a copy, maybe 2 of this in your deck in place of like the ambusher that we have at 7 resources, Darth Vader. Now, I think Darth Vader is better in some cases, and I think Maul is better in other cases. It really depends on what you're looking for. Obviously, Darth Vader is going to be way more valuable when you're looking to flood the board and get advantage on control decks and more mid-rangey matchups. However, Maul is going to absolutely annihilate things like, you know, again, the more aggressive decks like Gorilla Attack Pod decks where they're trying to finish off the game on that, 5th or 6th turn, and maybe you're playing super laser techs or resupplies and you're getting to Maul turn early, and you can just annihilate their board, keep Maul around as a 7/6. Remember, as long as you have an underworld unit, you can just keep doing this every single turn, which is absolutely crazy. So I think Maul's going to be really great, and I think this guy is really powerful, and I do think he's going to be played, especially since he's command villainy. Very easy colors to go ahead and ramp into him. Next up, we have Kragan Gore, a ground unit in just villainy as a 6 resources. We have a 6/6 underworld. When an enemy unit attacks your base, give a shield token to a friendly unit in the same arena as the attacker. This is a really interesting mechanic because the way you look at this is, okay, who is going to be attacking your base when your opponent has a 6/6 on the battlefield? Well, aggressive decks. That means that aggressive decks are probably going to try to bypass your units, hit your base, and as a result, you're going to get shield tokens to a friendly unit. This can give itself shield tokens, so you could have like a 6/6 shielded in just Kragan Gore if they attack your base. Okay, that allows you to essentially trade with your opponent's units without losing your unit at all, or even taking any damage, which can be pretty strong. However, if you're playing a more mid-rangey, or let's say controlling shell, or against those types of decks, they probably are just going to be attacking your 6/6 on itself, and having a 6 resource 6/6 is not like particularly impressive. So realistically, I don't know if this card is actually going to be good enough to bring you back in those aggro matchups. I don't think it's going to be high enough value in the control matchups. In mid-rangey matchups where you might be racing in some cases or trading off with opponents' units in others, this could maybe get some value where you just don't want your opponent, or your opponent doesn't want to attack your base because you have this 6/6 that's going to become a 6/6 shielded, which is absolutely obnoxious to deal with. I don't know how powerful it is in terms of actually being used in part of villainy decks. Also because if, let's say, your opponent has a space arena dominated and you're playing a Kragan Gore, yeah, you can just bypass Kragan Gore entirely, both the on attack into the base trigger as well as the 6/6 body, by just being in the space arena, which ends up being pretty bad for Kragan Gore. I think there's a little bit too much situational things going on. If this said, when an enemy unit attacks, give a shield token to a friendly unit in the same arena, I could see this being a lot more impressive, because what this allows you to do is potentially give a shield token to the unit that the opponent's attacking, which is probably why they didn't do that, because that's extremely obnoxious and that's really powerful and really puts a hoser on mid-range decks. But I don't know if this is going to be more powerful than a lot of the other 6 resource plays that we currently have. So not a huge fan, but does have some nice value, and I do think gives you a little bit of options in terms of value trading if you are able to satisfy the conditions. Next up, we have Sinara San, a 4 resource vigilance villainy 3/6 grit. When this unit is exhausted, she gains bounty, deal 5 damage to a base. So when she comes down, she's exhausted, which means she immediately has the bounty. But the way this works is a 3/6 for 4 is decent stat line, right? When you look at 4 resource plays, you're looking at most often 8 points of stats. So 4/4 is like a reasonable stat line. Usually you want a little bit more than that in order to be really impressive, but 4/4 is fine. This has essentially that same stat line, but in terms of higher toughness and a little bit lower power. So in some cases, you're not going to be able to trade with your opponent's 3-drop, which is a little bit unfortunate, but you will end up with a much higher statted unit in terms of power, which makes it a lot more aggressive if your opponent ever hits this, or you ever hit your opponent's units and trade off with something, or not necessarily trade off, but finish off something and keep this unit around. Here's the problem with this. If you're in a more grit focus, value synergy based unit deck, you probably can't afford the bounty that this card has. Getting hit by 5 when you kill an opponent's units, or getting 5 damage into their base when you kill an opponent's unit, is absolutely absurd. And that is a really big problem with Sinara San. Now, there are some situations where if they're not able to deal with it immediately, it can just ready up, and then you can kind of put it in a situation where she attacks last. And so when your opponent, goes through all their actions, she attacks as the last action that's being done in a round. She immediately readies up, and then you don't have the bounty to deal with. I don't know how valuable that's going to be because, well, the 3/6 body doesn't lend itself to being more, well, aggressive than your opponent, and that's ending up what you kind of want to do, because otherwise you are trying to hit an opponent's unit and then get in for damage immediately after to their base before this thing dies. So I guess maybe you're able to get some decent chunks of damage out. Maybe you can trade with 2 opponents' units with the addition of some other removal spells or other units. I'm just not sure how valuable that's going to be when we're looking at a lot of other Krayt synergies. Another note is that it works with Grand Inquisitor, though, which means that she's essentially a 5/4 for 4, which is actually pretty nice. And she immediately readies and attacks for 5 on turn 3. Now that actually ends up being pretty good. And if we get any other Grit synergies, for example, like Kira as a leader, where you can give 2 damage to Sinara San and give her a shield token, so she becomes a 5/4 shielded with Grit, that could be pretty interesting as well. So I think that if you look at her as a 3/6, I don't see the value in her, and I think that she's pretty weak. However, if you pair her with the leaders that are meant to be played with Grit, or leaders that synergize with Grit quite nicely, I see a value for Sinara San, both as a more controlling option or mid-rangey option like Kira, or in a more aggressive option like Grand Inquisitor. I see some potential there. However, I do think the bounty is a pretty big one. You just need to time it right. And if you're able to time it right, like she trades off immediately, and where she's untapped after you've already attacked with her, then maybe. But if you're attacking, right? If you're attacking someone and you're trying to trade with their unit, they get the bounty claim. Just remember that, because she's exhausted on attacks. Next up, we finally have the underworld payoff that we are looking for. Cad Bane, a brand new cunning vigilance leader. Whenever you play an underworld card, you may exhaust this leader. If you do, deal an opponent chooses a unit they control, you deal 1 damage to it. So a really nice way of just getting extra value across all of your units, as if you're playing this guy, you probably have a vast majority of underworld cards, things like Boba Fett, for example. You play it, you get a nice little value there, or any other underworld card, even the Outlaw Corona that we were talking about earlier, the space unit, like these types of cards, you just play them, you get some extra value, you get some damage on your opponent's units, and it maybe makes it easier for you to trade with them. Or if you get lucky, you hit 3 ones, or maybe your opponent doesn't have many options, and so they're forced to deal damage to something that they don't necessarily want to, and you get a little bit of value there. Now, that's pretty good and all well and good in terms of just getting extra damage to your opponent's units every single turn, essentially, because you're playing underworld cards. However, as I mentioned in a lot of other videos, we really need to know how powerful the flip side of a leader is in order to evaluate whether or not it can be realistically played. This one's a 6 to deploy, 2/8, not that great. However, it has raid 2, and it ups the ability in that whenever you play an underworld card, you can deal 2 damage instead of that 1. And remember, they choose a unit, so you don't get to choose. However, you get 2 damage instead of 1. So this one, 2/8 on defense. Pretty bad as a 6 resource to deploy. However, it's also 4/8 on offense, which is pretty good. So this really, really intends you to play it a lot more aggressively, and maybe in the idea of dealing damage to your opponent's units and slowly claiming bounties and getting some value there, and then finishing the deal, maybe finishing off bounties with Cad Bane, maybe getting a couple bounties claimed because he's such high toughness, or just getting in for a lot of damage. I like the additional damage that you get from playing those underworld cards, and I do think that with that, you might be surprised at how many times you can actually trade with an opponent's unit or just kill off their unit with that 2 power. 2 power looks pretty bad, and it is. However, the ability and the raid 2 really bring this card up, and I actually do think Cad Bane can have some really nice potential with an underworld style deck. I don't know if we're going to prefer Cad Bane over something like Boba Fett leader, right? There's the same aspects of villainy cunning, and while this is a powerful effect of getting a little bit of ping here and there every single turn, the fact that your opponent can choose means that they can obviously choose the worst option for you, which is a little bit weak. And is that going to be stronger than going ahead and just leveraging additional resources? I'm not sure. However, Cad Bane looks interesting, and I do think he's at least a viable option in an underworld style deck. Next up, we have Gar Saxon, another leader that we got to talk about, and this one is the upgrade leader. Now we have Mandalorian already, who kind of synergize with upgrades and giving you that mid-rangey style, try to get to the mid-game because you're exhausting all your opponent's units with all the upgrades you're playing. Gar Saxon is much more of an aggressively positioned leader in which you're trying to upgrade your units and getting them the +1/+0 just by putting upgrades on your units. Now you can do this with shield tokens, upgrade tokens. You can do this with upgrades themselves. I think that you can do a mix of them and have a really nicely positioned deck to where you're playing a vigilance villainy. Maybe you're playing double vigilance. Maybe you're playing, vigilance aggression or vigilance cunning, depending on what upgrades we see in the future. I do think that in general, I'm looking at vigilance aggression as the option here because you have a nice suite of options to choose from so far as we've seen. However, this isn't the only thing that's got going for it. The flip side is really powerful. The 6th deploy leader, and he's a 4/7, so a really nice stat line. That's kind of the ideal stat line you're looking for on a 6 to deploy leader. If it's like a 3/7, you're like, whatever, it's okay. A 4/7 is kind of like what we want to see on a 6 to deploy leader. And this one, each friendly upgraded unit gets +1/+0, and when defeated, you may return an upgrade that was attached to this unit to its owner's hand. So we've kind of wanted to see some sort of way that upgrade-based strategies can get around all the removal and the 2-for-1s that you're getting basically every turn because you're relying on upgrades. And this is a great way to do that. Exactly. You play your upgrades, you can get them back after they've been defeated and then replay them, which is really, really strong. So I do think this is really powerful. And I think that Gar Saxon has a really nice position to be the go-to upgrade leader, and it could be really, really powerful. Imagine you go like follower of the way and you put an experience token or whatever upgrade you put on it. It's a 1/3. Let's say you put an experience token on it, it becomes a 2/4, which ends up becoming a 3/4 because of Gar Saxon. A 2/4 that becomes a 3/5 because of follower of the way. That becomes a 4/5 because of Gar Saxon. And that's a really impressive stat line, right? And that's just putting an experience token on it. If you put some sort of armor or something on it, it becomes even better. And Gar Saxon, similar to Directive Krennic, where just getting you that nice little stat bump is one of the most powerful things you can be doing, as it applies in every scenario that you can trigger this. And if you have a deck that is using that as a leader, you probably are able to trigger it very frequently, if not all the time. Next up, we have Lady Proxima, which is a 1-resource colorless unit, 0/4 Underworld. When you play another Underworld card, you may deal 1 damage to a base. Now, this doesn't have a once per turn restriction, and the fact that she's a 0/4 makes it that maybe a little bit less likely to be played, but getting direct damage in your Underworld decks is really interesting, right? Let's say you're playing this on turn 1 and you followed up with like a Greedo or some sort of 1-drop that's actually viable. You get to deal 1 damage to their base, and you get a 3/1 and you get a 0/4. Now, your opponent doesn't really want to kill the Lady Proxima, right? It's a 0/4. It's not attacking for anything, and it doesn't do as much damage as like Greedos or whatever unit you're playing will do if they don't deal with that. So they're kind of forced to deal with your other units. And if they're forced to deal with your other units, every single unit that you're playing afterwards just deals an extra damage. So I think this card actually does have some viable options if you're playing a really aggressively situated Underworld-based deck, where you play your Underworld cards, you get the direct damage, and you have other threats where your opponent has to focus on rather than Lady Proxima, right? Because again, Lady Proxima, yeah, she might deal 3-4 damage over the course of a couple turns, but Greedo will deal way more over the course of a couple turns, so they have to deal with something that has higher power, and they're not dealing with Lady Proxima because of that. So the fact that she's a 1-resource and she doesn't die in 1 hit, I like that a lot more. There are some downsides in which, maybe they kill Lady Proxima and then they kill your Greedo because they can do both, and now you're down 2 cards, which could be a downside. But I do think this card actually has some potential just because she is a 1-resource play and she can combine with another 1-resource play to immediately deal damage, and you have another threat on the board. Next up, we have Xanadu Blood, another rare here, a 6-resource space unit, cunning villainy here, 4/6, rate 2. When played on attack, you may return another non-leader underworld unit to its owner's hand. If you do, exhaust an enemy unit or resource. This is really powerful. The ability to exhaust an opponent's resource is not something that we see very often, and it is something that completely disrupts your opponent. This is something that can come down on turn 7, for example. Let's say you have the initiative, and then you exhaust your opponent's resource, whom was supposed to play a super laser blast that turn. And then boom, suddenly you get to get in with all the additional damage you have from building a big board last turn. And again, you could do this on attack, and you can even exhaust opponent's units, right? However, the downside is that you do have to return a friendly non-leader underworld unit. So that could be a decent downside. You probably have a lot on the board if you're playing this card in an underworld style of deck. However, it's also just a 6/6 space unit that's a 6/6 on attacks, a 4/6 on defense, which is a really nicely statted unit in an aggressive shell. And that's kind of where I see this being played. This just has everything that you're kind of looking for. The ability to disrupt your opponent's tempo, the ability to potentially race your opponent by exhausting enemy units, and getting in for a lot of damage. Remember, you can always attack with a unit that you're planning on returning to your hand before you play this, or attack with this in order for you to get the damage in, and then play it, and then disrupt your opponent's strategy afterwards. Granted, they can also do some other actions before you do that, and maybe get in with some damage before you can even exhaust a unit. So you just keep that in mind. But I do think this is pretty powerful as a really nicely aggressively statted unit. The only downside to this is, what do we have at 6 resource and cunning villainy as a space unit? That's fire spray. And again, it all comes back to, do we want to see other leaders, or are we going to see Boba Fett still be the top dog? And well, I still think Boba Fett's probably the top dog. And the fact that that immediately enters ready, you're going to find that Fett's fire spray is going to deal a massive chunk more damage than you will with Xanadu Blood. Generally speaking, Boba Fett decks, if you're playing like double yellow or an aggressively positioned Boba Fett deck, you can really end the game on turn 5 or turn 6 before Xanadu Blood can even really affect the board. So just something to keep in mind. And lastly, we have a couple cards that was spoiled here on a YouTube video. First up, we have Cobb Vanth, and this is arguably the strongest card I've seen so far in terms of earlier plays that you can make in the game, right? We've seen Darth Vaders, we've seen like Luke Skywalkers be amazing top end cards. Cobb Vanth is one of the best early game plays that I've seen so far, comparable to like Boba Fett in terms of how valuable, or in terms of what you can get out of that card, right? Boba Fett just has a certain stat line. This does not, but you get an absurd effect out of it. So it's a 3 resource ground unit in command. 3/2, when defeated, search the top 10 cards of your deck for a unit that costs 2 or less and discard it. For this phase, you may play that card from your discard pile for free. So essentially what this is a 3 resource, 3/2 that dies into a 2 resource play. That's really powerful. Something that ends up giving you more value even after it's played and gets killed is something that we don't really see that often. And it's comparable to something like Darth Vader on a much smaller scale, right? You get a unit, you get another unit out of this card, and its effect happens no matter what, in terms of, yeah, you can use this, attack your opponent's base, and if they're the more controlling deck, they kind of are forced to kill it because they don't want a 3-powered unit attacking their base. If you're a mid-rangey deck, maybe you trade with your opponent's 2-drop, and guess what? You get a 2 resource play out of it. If you're playing an aggressive deck, well, guess what? They don't really want to trade with this unit, and you get to trade with their unit and maybe get something that can also trade with another unit that they have. This seems really powerful to me. The only downside I see to this unit is if you're playing against a unit that has really high toughness, let's say a Boba Fett's on the other side of the battlefield, they get to go ahead and maybe kill your Cobb Vanth for free because Boba Fett is absurd and it's exhausted or whatever. But let's say Cobb Vanth gets in for damage and Boba Fett becomes a 3/2 after the fight. Then you get a 2 resource play. Yeah, you get the when played ability of whatever 2 resource play you're getting, and maybe you can end up trading with Boba Fett in terms of giving you more value in the long run with when attack triggers or whatever it is. But at least you traded 1 for 1. And I don't really see a situation where Cobb Vanth isn't going to trade 1 for 1. And most of the time, it'll trade more than that, or just get in for a lot of damage and keep on the pressure. And that is one thing that I really see as a really powerful reason to play this card, is if you are an aggressive deck, playing Cobb Vanth is in your best interest, as they need to deal with your threats. And this is a threat that hits for 3 on 3, which is normally what your threats are doing anyways. You think like Sabine Yellow, you're playing like Ezra Bridgers, for example, or you're playing like Sabine Green, and you're playing red 3s, or whatever you're playing, wing leaders, and you're getting somewhat the same amount of stat line in terms of offensive power, while also getting another unit when it gets killed, which is really powerful. But we also have a really big fatty, a 9 resource ground unit, Krayt Dragon, a legendary, a 10/10 overwhelm. When an opponent plays a card, you may deal damage equal to that card's cost to their base or a ground unit they control. I love the fact that you can choose ground unit or base. That makes it way more interesting for me. And this is a card that I think is absolutely absurd. Okay, you play this on turn 8, and anything your opponent plays just probably ends the game, right? If you are like a mid-range, what I consider like, let's say, big aggression deck, where you're trying to get to the later stages of the game, maybe you're in Heroism and you're playing things like Wrecker, although Wrecker, I guess, puts you down a resource, maybe you don't want to play Krayt Dragon. But let's say you're playing a deck that has, you know, nice little 1-for-1 trades, or even 2-for-1 trades in some cases, and trying to get to the later stages of the game by trading off your units, maybe healing up a little bit, etc. And then you drop this Krayt Dragon, and anything your opponent plays, let's say they play a removal spell on this, like Fell the Dragon, which I think is pretty synergistic. Boom, you get to hit their base for 4, which is really nice. And I think that's really powerful about this card, is it's a way to deal direct damage. The only question I have is, are you going to be able to get to 9 resources? And if you are, which matchups are you going to be able to get to 9 resources? Obviously, in the aggro mirror, let's say you're playing an aggro deck and you're trying to run Krayt Dragon, this isn't going to do anything. The game is going to be over before turn 8, almost assuredly. Let's say you're playing a mid-range deck and you're trying to get 9 resources. If you're playing against the aggro matchup, you're probably not going to be able to get to turn 8. The game is probably going to be over by then, or in a position where you would have won the game without Krayt Dragon. Any other 9 resource play would have done it, right? Krayt Dragon is just one of the many. However, I think the way this comes into play is if you're in the mid-range mirror or against the control matchup, Krayt Dragon comes in and is an absolute game changer. In order for them to really do anything in the game, they must pay the tax that Krayt Dragon has. And let's say they play like an Avenger or a big spell, a big event, a big unit. Boom, you're getting hit for like 8, 9, 10 damage on your base, which is absolutely absurd. And if you're playing a deck that's mid-range or that type of situation, then Krayt Dragon probably is just the game ender, right? Like you probably have a decent amount of damage on your opponent's base already, and then Krayt Dragon ends the game for you. So Krayt Dragon to me looks really powerful. I'm just curious about which archetype, which set of cards is going to fill in the role of getting you to Krayt Dragon. That's what I want to see, and I'm really curious to see that happen. Overall, guys, that's going to round us out for all the cards that we've seen today. Krayt Dragon is by far, alongside Cobb Vanth, the coolest cards that are on the list so far. But I'm really curious to see what Tarfful could do in that Wookiee-based synergy deck. I like Outlaw Corona, has a limited card. I think the downside's too big to pay. This is a good case study on how powerful Bounty is for your opponents and whether or not you can get away with playing some really big downsides on a better statted unit. I think Outlaw Corona will tell us that. And I think Maul is going to be a staple in the villainy command decks, at least a 1 or 2 of in those decks. And I'm also really curious to see what things like Cad Bane and Gar Saxon can do for the underworld / upgrade theme decks, as those are 2 big themes of this set. And I think these are the kind of signpost leaders for those types of strategies, just as Kira is for Grit and things like that. I think that we're going to see some really cool synergies with Gar Saxon, and I'm excited to build him out. So let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I will see you all for a video tomorrow.